Welcome, everyone. I'm Ann Chamberlin, and I get to be the moderator for this panel. And mostly, I will defer to my esteemed colleagues here on this subject. I just thought I'd mention the most recent urban battle I have written about is Stalingrad during World War II, where the battle was for one cellar or one crumbling wall, and freezing days and nights and so many lives. Let's let the other panelists introduce themselves. I'll go how they are on my screen, which is starting with Eric. I can't hear you, Eric.
Okay. Can you see me?
I can see you. I can hear you.
Okay. Sorry. My name is Eric Swedin. I'm a professor of history at Weber State University. My background, part of my background is as a military historian. I've published some books and articles about military history. It's a very interesting topic for me. I'm also a science fiction writer, and my biggest claim to fame was 10 years ago, I won the Sidewise Award for the best alternate history novel of the year, which was a novel called When Angels Wept, a what-if history of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Cool. Okay, Gordon next.
My name is Gordon Frye. I am also a professor of history, although merely an adjunct. Vincennes University, the campus in Bremerton, Washington at Naval Base Kitsap, where I teach U.S. history, world history, and naval history. I also am that oddball academic. I also work in a gun store, so I have a broad range of interesting interests. I've done a fair amount of writing nonfiction on my favorite subject is actually 16th century warfare. There's plenty of urban warfare in 16th century too, so there's it's ugly, nasty stuff. So I'm looking forward to this panel quite a bit.
Okay, Keith, please.
Hello, I'm Keith Haus. I'm an intercultural historian. That means I study how cultures interact. My first real anthropological study, I was in 8th grade, and I decided to find out how gangs work, so I hung out with gang members. Got in a lot of trouble because a gang war broke out while I was doing the study. So I am going to give a lot more modern point of view. And I just realized Gordon is from my neck of the woods. I live in Spokane, but I visit Bremerton very often.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, you have to come by and visit me at Borner Firearms in Gorst, which is right down next to near the aircraft carriers.
Oh, nice. I know all the owners of all the arcades in town. I know all the owners.
Oh, okay. I don't know any of them.
Well, one of them is right next to your base.
Oh, very good.
Great, thanks. Welcome, Keith. And Mongo.
My name is Mongo. I am a former corporal of Marines who spends way too much time studying history, but when it came to degrees, I'm an English major. So I'm the only non-history degree-bearing person in this conversation. I do, however, love studying it. I actually have to laugh about Anne's comment about Stalingrad. I own Chuikov's copy of Battle for Stalingrad. Fascinating book. I have been published actually for Urban Warfare in Peter Nealon's Spot Reps. If you get the chance, folks, buy a copy, please. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Gordon suggested before we got on here that we start by bringing a historical perspective to this discussion. So I hope the first thing, let's talk about urban war. The first thing you need for an urban, I suppose, is a city. So panelists, would you like to discuss this history, the history of urban warfare?
Well, it goes back to whenever you have a city, obviously, and you get sieges. Once you get walls around villages and towns, you have to have siege warfare. And once you get siege warfare, things get really nasty. Because the guys outside want to get inside, and they're very upset that they can't get inside very quickly. And bad things happen, you have the sacking, like the sacking of Troy, the sack of Rome, etc. Things like that. Just urban warfare to me seems just a whole lot uglier and more intense than warfare, say, on an open plain out in the farm fields. It just seems much more intense, much more ugly, and a whole lot bloodier.
Somebody else want to?
Well, urban
Just
warfare. Urban warfare really, there comes a decision to have urban warfare. If you don't want a city to be there, you can simply destroy it. There are ways to do that. In fact, some of the sieges Gordon was referencing, they just simply flattened the city and killed everybody involved.
Carthage.
Mongolians did it all the time, where they were just like, well, you've insulted us, you no longer exist. And that was an actual decision. If you are Grand Moff Tarkin and you find out there's a spy on a planet and your troops can't get to him, you'll simply destroy the planet. You have no problems whatsoever with doing that. So urban warfare comes with decisions to keep the city there. It comes with the desire to keep the people there working for some reason. It could simply be you don't have the ability to destroy the city, which is difficult to do because even in those ancient times, they had ways to just wipe cities out. They'd release pigs into the city and just let them eat all the people. And yay, stuff like that. So there's ways to destroy the city. It comes with a decision to keep it alive. And that's where I think it really starts to start.
Yeah, the modern Israelis like 155 millimeter artillery for doing that.
Yes.
It does a really good job.
Artillery is a wonderful tool for that and has been throughout the ages. Where it gets interesting is especially as you move forward as humanity industrialized, what they could do for a projectile became incredible. Stalin's hammer, the Russian artillery piece, a gun so large that when they tried mounting it on a tracked Joseph Stalin system, they broke the transmission and launched the crew off of the gun. It was useful for what? Direct fire. Hey, if you're going to do it right. And a 203 millimeter piece is a hell of a door knocker. But it comes with the price. Everything you destroy, you have to clear before you can get inside. Everything you destroy, you might need later on. So it's, how much do we have to destroy before we're going to make it inside? How big of a breach in the walls do we have to make in order to get through and beat the defenders?
Eric. Can't hear you. You're muted again, Eric.
Yeah, I'm muted. Sorry. I'm back. So,
Hey.
the description, as I read through the description, guerrillas in the mist, fighting urban wars, and then I read through all the prompt questions they have, the sneak questions. I think what we have is we're really trying to talk about two really different things. One is guerrillas, which is irregular warfare, which is asymmetrical warfare. These are some of the terms that are used for it. And the other one is urban warfare, which is fighting in build-up areas. And they're not the same thing at all. They can
I'm so glad
be.
you said that.
There can be an association, but they're not. They're really not, because urban warfare. When you talk about a situation where there's urban warfare, the first question you have is the enemy wearing uniforms? If the enemy is wearing uniforms, then what you have is a traditional conventional war, but it's happening within a build-up space. But if the enemy is not wearing uniforms, now not all guerrillas, some guerrillas wear uniforms, some don't. It's a different, it depends. And in the modern world, the rules of war between whether someone's wearing a uniform or not wearing a uniform make the rules are completely different. And you're going like, war doesn't have rules. Every human activity has rules. And weirdly enough, wars have rules. The United States military, lawyers rule. and what are called the rules of engagement are very specific about how they're expected to handle. Are you talking with irregular forces, or are you talking about regular forces? And it's a totally different setup. And we could concentrate on one or the other, but I think that as we go through our discussion, we need to be aware that for our audience, they may just get confused with these two things being confused. I think we could talk about urban warfare, which I think is interesting, and everyone's sort of concentrated on that. But the entire all of the prompts are really about guerrilla warfare, which is a totally different type of setup. So I guess we look to guidance to our moderator.
Well, I'm so glad you pointed that out, because I have here circled on my notes, guerrillas are not the same as urban necessarily. So I haven't made up my mind yet about that, but I'm glad you pointed that out. And I hoped I guess I'm more thinking that guerrillas is the direction we're going. I was not ready to move away from the historical thing yet, okay, because I write historical stuff, and I think one of my favorite battle writers, who's Bernard Cornwell, he doesn't seem to have ever done an urban, have had an actual insight urban. Maybe you can correct me on that, because I think, if ever I need to write a battle, he would be my go-to person to see how it's done. Or if we take Robin Hood as perhaps a guerrilla, if we say maybe he was a veteran of the Crusades, that's, he's probably just a made-up character, but say he's a veteran of the Crusades and he's a guerrilla fighter, how's he going to get into the castle without gunpowder, and without the army to surround the place? And I also wanted to point out that you mentioned siege warfare, and I had a beta reader once say, "Oh, this is so boring," when I had written a siege, and sort of that was the idea.
Welcome to Siege.
Here they are.
I think the only Sharp novel that comes close is when Sharp earns Valiant Stormer honors. Otherwise, most of his stuff takes place out in the field, operating with, for example, Portuguese and Spanish guerrillas.
Yeah. So there is the Sharp novels that I actually liked were the ones that were set in India, and one of them is a siege novel. I'm not against the other Sharp novels. I just haven't read them. And there is, and one of his Last Kingdom novels is a siege of London. So, but he doesn't, I think he recognizes that all Sharp novels are formulaic. All of them have the big climactic battle at the end. And he's moving quickly to tell that story, and he's not going to, he's a professional entertainer. He's not going to get drawn down to all the details of the scene. Have some fascinating ones, fascinating details. So I find sieges fascinating also, Gordon, but I don't, you have to be really interested in military warfare to enjoy that type of story.
I would say that one of the best literary descriptions of siege warfare is Arturo Perez in his A la Triste series. He's got one book is mostly about the siege of Breda during the 80 Years' War between the Netherlands and Spain. And it is rugged and ugly. And the film version starring Viggo Mortensen. It's in Spanish, but it's just a wonderful film. They go into some of the underground aspects of siege warfare, and digging mines underneath the walls in order to blow them up and topple them down. And of course, that was something that they used from ancient times. They would mine underneath walls and set up timbers to hold up the walls in the meantime, and then set fire to it. But the guys who were doing mining and counter mining and whatnot, that's ugly. One of the things I wanted to bring out, which also gets into guerrilla warfare too, was when the Russians fought against the Chechens in Grozny. The Chechens were trying to extricate themselves from the Soviet Union. And Grozny proved a lot of things, and one of them was that urban warfare is three-dimensional. And it doesn't matter if you're a guerrilla or regular army, it's still three-dimensional, because you have buildings, you have fire coming from above, you have street level, and you have the underground infrastructure that people can use to move back and forth. And it's just a nightmare. I mean, this was the same thing you saw in Stalingrad too. It's just an absolute nightmare. And armies have historically avoided siege warfare if they could. It's much handier to beat the enemy in the field and force his cities to capitulate than it is to engage in siege warfare, because it's just really, really nasty. There's a great story about John Smith, the guy in Jamestown, and he was in the wars between the Turks and the Austrians, and there was a siege, and everybody was bored. The Turks were bored, the Austrians were bored, and so they had a test. They had 3 champions from each side that met in the middle and fought it out to the death, just because everybody was bored and wanted to see what was going to go. They wanted a sports game. And John Smith ended up being the only survivor, and he cut the head off of the last Turk and shook it around, and then the Turks attacked out of frustration and anger, and the Austrians beat them. Anyway, it's boring until the few seconds of absolute sheer terror.
That is the thing about war, is most war is boring until it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And I have friends who checked the time on their watch based on the sniper rifle, because it would always arrive at the same time every day. And I've heard various theories on how that happened, but that's how they check their watch. It just became boring for them. So one of the things go ahead.
It gets boring, and at some point you really come to terms with your own mortality, and you're like, if today's the day I go, whoop-de-doo. I ain't gonna sweat it. Till then, I'm just sitting here chilling. Hey, we got a good game of spades going. What's the worst that could happen?
Let's play some Call of Duty. Yeah.
Did you finish your thought, Keith?
No. There's to go back a little bit. They're actually the decision that I was talking about is: do you want to keep the people in the city alive? And that's the difference between the siege warfare that we're talking about and then the guerrilla warfare that Eric brought up. If you want to keep the people in the city alive, you do a completely different type of warfare than if you just want to level it. The Battle of Fallujah was siege warfare on a city that most of the citizens had left, as far as I know. Whereas, downtown Baghdad was very much so a guerrilla warfare, where they literally had zones where they were like, okay, this is blue, this is our base, this is the green zone, we know we're safe here. Everything outside of this zone that we're going to walk through is dangerous, and we don't know when the attack will happen. Most of the time it's boring until it's not. And that's actually pretty common even throughout eras that we've been talking about, the ancient kings in the Middle East. Oh, dang it, I can't remember their names. The nations and all those guys.
Sumerians,
they would have their area that they were like, this is protected. That's where we're going to keep the walls. And then they'd have villages outside, and then they'd have walls there. And the village itself could actually rebel against the king, take him down, tear everything down, put in a new king pretty fast. And it was the exact same scenario. Mao Zedong actually wrote a treatise on guerrilla warfare, and it's pretty much used to this day by every guerrilla warfare group I've seen, where, he's like, we're actually trying to get to them mentally, not physically.
Yeah.
We're trying to wear them down till they do as we say, because the other option is, just the boredom and kind of insanity of waiting.
You see adoption of stuff like that, or of Mao's treatise by groups like the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Yes, folks, for those of you watching, there really is a terror organization engaged in guerrilla warfare in the Philippines, whose initials spell out MILF.
Great.
Filipinos,
And they
man.
expect to be taken seriously.
Okay.
Yes,
One thing that
they have been around a lot longer than that acronym has been around for other purposes.
But go ahead. Sorry, Eric. Go ahead.
I was just going to mention, historically, we could talk about current things like Fallujah and Baghdad and that, but if you go back historically, often sieges before urban warfare would break out were resolved by which side had disease break out faster. The besieger or the besieged, because that became what was really devastating. And sieges were really hard to maintain because it was really hard to maintain an army in the field in a concentrated area for that long. And of course, inside the city, cities were unhealthy, period. So it was a serious problem, especially if people get weaker because they don't have enough food, they don't have enough water, they don't have anything like clean water, which of course is just asking for cholera outbreaks and diphtheria and other such wonders.
Yeah.
Now, sieges of Paris were notoriously nasty.
Yeah, it's hard to keep a city going when you can't get rid of your sewage, and if you try to, the people you're going against will climb up your sewage to attack you. So,
And that's been done.
Yes.
Every Catholic has certain bends and turns specifically to stop people from climbing up it.
One of the things, back to Mao, is he said the guerrilla must be the fish in the sea of the people, and swimming in the sea of the people. And that it makes, certainly for today, urban warfare far more palatable to the guerrilla, because there's a whole lot more people living in urban environments than in the countryside. And so if you have a city that is definitely on the same side as the guerrillas and supporting the guerrillas and whatnot, you leave a very, very sticky problem for your for an occupying army or for a besieging army or whatever, because as Eric mentioned, if they're not wearing uniforms, you can't tell. And so what often happens is they just take every military age man out and shoot them because they don't know who's who. So they make, the old thing like the French Crusaders said in southern France, kill them all, let God sort them out.
Guerrilla warfare works best against an occupying adversary that is bound by some sort of moral code.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That constrains them from engaging in genocidal warfare.
Yes. No, go ahead, Eric. Please finish.
I was just going to say, and genocidal warfare, and you're going like, well, we should just engage in genocidal warfare. There is a very complex morality around the idea of wanting to engage in genocidal warfare, because you have to have made the guerrillas and the people that support them so strongly other that you're willing to engage in genocidal warfare. Most people want to be heroes in their own stories. And when you're engaged in genocidal warfare, you're no longer a hero in your story, or you are at high risk of not being a hero in your own story.
Yeah.
And
Well, that's how both India and Ireland got their independence, is because the British standard they had to live up to, for international standing.
though with regards to Ireland, it took them 800 years to find it.
Yeah, but it was what, like 200 IRA members against the entire British Army for 20 years. But, it worked.
Another
The
example
British,
for contemporary events would actually be the DC sniper setting. Because they were able to blend in to the regular environment, it's that much harder to find them.
Absolutely.
Had it been somebody or a group of somebodies who actually knew what they're doing, how long do they tie down the city of DC before they finally get caught? Because the methods to actually get them are, as you said, something that crosses moral boundaries and goes into gray area and even into black area of, we can't do this.
Christopher Dorner in LA. He tied down the entire city of LA. One guy.
Yeah.
I think we do need to distinguish, though, when we're talking about these, between things that are clearly law enforcement situations,
True,
like the DC sniper, and things where you do have an insurrection or you do have guerrilla movement, that law enforcement is insufficient. Even National Guard type units are insufficient. And then you have to deploy the military, which is a totally different situation. And being deployed in its own nation is, from a moral and ethical and legal and storytelling standpoint, is completely different than in another place.
But it's all fourth generation warfare when you get down to it. I mean,
would you like to
as long as there's some political.
Define that for us, please.
Okay, first generation warfare would be like linear warfare, Napoleonic warfare. Second generation warfare is World War I, where you move up against the target, something slowing you down, then you paste it with artillery and move on. And that's, the United States still uses that. We got it from the French in World War I. We are in love with it, and that's what we still do. Third generation warfare would be maneuver warfare, like Blitzkrieg, for example, warfare that we still haven't figured out ourselves. And although the Marine Corps tries occasionally, but fourth generation warfare is more hearts and minds. And the ability for the guerrilla, or even if it's a guerrilla supported from the outside, which is primarily the only way they work, guerrillas who are on their own generally die. Guerrillas who have outside support often win. And that's what the United States Army Special Forces are specifically designed and trained to do, is to go into generally foreign areas and put together guerrilla organizations. And so there's that mix between regular army and the and actual guerrilla warfare. And like in Afghanistan, to begin with, the special forces were extremely successful. They wore beards. They actually respected the culture. They understood it. And then when Big Army got in there, they just screwed it all up, because that's what, Big Green does. They don't understand and they don't care, and they think high explosives is the way to deal with all problems. Unless you're the sergeant major, and then you think reflective belts are the way to deal with all problems. But at any rate, there is a real difficulty in this guerrilla warfare scenario, especially urban, in distinguishing who's on your side, who's not, who's a combatant, who's not a combatant. And that's where we get into the moral aspects, like Eric was talking about. Napoleon said moral is to physical as 10 is to 1. So if you don't have moral strength on your side and morale, you can lose easily.
Yeah, that brings up another thought. Those special forces are doing a lot of what the gang leaders were doing. They'd send in what I could basically describe as recruiters. They would go in to meet 10-year-olds, tell them, hey, this is really cool what we're doing. Hey, want to go get drunk? We're going to go get drunk. We're going to do all this stuff. You're invited. You want to be part of this group? And gangs have major powers within the areas they run. The police will not go into the ghetto specifically because it is run by those gang members. And they will recruit people and make these kids think this is the coolest thing ever. And then say, okay, now we've got these enemies. And they kind of dehumanize the enemy. And it was kind of creepy when I realized what I was watching, especially when I realized it was being aimed at me when I was doing my my first research. And I've spoken to people who research stuff like terrorism and all that, and they've got the same kind of recruiters. They've got the same kind of people.
Mhm.
There's corporate, sponsorship from and money from other means, and we often don't know where the other means comes from. Looks Iranian, but that's another story. And
White tell you it is.
yeah, and they will, provide all the training and stuff, and then they'll send these recruits out to go do the things. And we have tapes of the first time terrorists, and these first timers are like, "Am I doing the right thing? This seems kind of awful." And the recruiter's like, "Oh no, you're doing the right thing," and he's acting almost like a father figure. It creeps me out because the best comparison I have is to a Cub Scout or a Boy Scout leader. And I say that because I'm a Cub Scout leader. And I'm like, wow, I could turn these kids into something really messed up if I wanted to. No wonder we have so many rules.
Yes.
Well, also, gangs, in fact, are militias by any other term. There was a really good paper written by a couple of Army majors when they were at the Naval Institute of all places, but it was on rethinking militias and the roles they play. And when you have law enforcement that is insufficient or not there or on the wrong side, then these militias grow organically, and they grow, they evolve, they recruit. The good ones provide services to their local population. The bad ones merely are parasites and generally don't last all that long because they lose the moral high ground. If they provide services, provide protection, provide law enforcement, they grow, they survive.
So Eric,
Yes.
you had mentioned something in our conversations before this about cartels. You want to?
Right. So a story that a lot of people unfortunately aren't as familiar with as they should be is the problem that Mexico has right now with cartels.
Yeah.
And it's a good example where the cartels are using guerrilla tactics. They're using terrorism, but the purpose is not to gain political control. The purpose is to create a weak enough government so that they can continue to function in their illegal economic activities.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been very effective at doing that. And Mexico has really struggled in fighting against the cartels. And part of the problem is you have a really unusual situation in which they don't have external support, which is so important for most guerrilla movements. What they have is they have a business activity that provides a tremendous amount of money.
Yes.
And they are unbelievably well funded. And because they are so well funded in that way, they then use corruption to damage the ability of the government to function. And one of the things in general, the cartels are extremely strict about not doing activities in the United States because they're afraid that there'll be a backlash, and the last thing they want is for the United States to become seriously involved in fighting the cartels. And and for the United States to make the hard decisions necessary to actually be seriously involved, because where do you think all that money comes from?
Well, yeah, and the dividing line between money-making operations and terrorist groups, cartels, whatever, is pretty thin. There's a lot of overlap in both of them because cartels are using terrorism to help promote their activities, and terrorists, separatists, whatnot, are using drug running and drug production and whatnot, like in Afghanistan,